Progress.
Yeah, recording in progress. All right.
Computers
Welcome,
America.
everybody, to the Family Gospel Discussion evening. And do we have a volunteer for an opening prayer?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Gotta be loud enough everyone can hear.
Yeah. A little louder. Go ahead.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank thee for this day. We thank you that we could have this meeting. Please open this meeting. Please send thy angels to be around us. Please bless that everything will go well. In the name of Yeshua Messiah, Amen.
Amen.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. All right. So, not sure what we should talk about. We're trying to get a hold of Ted and find out if he actually wanted to talk about Jonah today. He was saying, and I can't. I have no idea what uh, what about it that he was going to talk about. So we'll see if
How,
he's
how about the power of fasting?
power of fasting. Well, I'm sure Jonah must have fasted at least 3 days. He was in the belly of the whale, unless, of course, I
Yeah.
guess the whale could have had some.
A
What
lot
are
of
they?
krill.
Krill. There you go. Something like that down in there, and I guess he would have just had to have sushi because probably pretty hard to start a fire inside there, but you never know. There must have been enough oxygen in there for him to live. So, unless, of course, it was, just a time traveling submarine that went back and nobody recognized it. And he was in the belly of the sub. And, they probably fed him. He had a nice warm cot to sleep on. Yeah.
That's not what he says. No.
Well, got shot out of a
He said
torpedo
he was
tube,
in,
landed on the beach.
I think he described it as being in the depths of hell, though.
Probably would have seemed that way to a guy who never even couldn't even fantasize about such a thing as a submarine, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, well, fasting definitely is a good topic and it's a fun topic. So why don't we start with just, physical benefits of fasting? Physical benefits are pretty easy to see, obviously, because you fast, you get a chance to empty your stomach, give your stomach a break, give your intestines a break, all that kind of stuff causes your body to munch away on all the leftovers that's in there.
All your reserves.
Yeah, gets the blood sugar down, and it restores everything else. It gives the liver and kidneys a chance to catch up, and all of the organs really. And that's all good. That's all good stuff. Especially you go 3 or 4 days, it actually does get a chance to clean things out, and it's once you get into it, it's pretty nice. It's not too hard after. The first day is always the hardest, and then the next day is not so bad. Might have a little bit of intense times, but it's not so bad. Then by the third day, you're doing pretty good. After the third day, it's really not that bad. It's not too hard after that. Um, let's see, what else can fasting do? What does fasting do on talking? Yeah, communicating with people. Fasting helps you talk less, I think, because first couple of days you're so tired and you don't want to talk and you're only thinking about food, so all you can talk about is food, and your friends will tell you, that's enough of that. So you talk less when you're fasting.
Yeah.
So there's an idea. What else? How about in your thoughts? What do your thoughts do?
Does help you focus your thoughts a lot more.
Yeah, well, at first you're only focused on how hungry you are, but after that,
It only lasts maybe a day.
yeah, if
After
that,
that, it usually gets harder to start eating again.
yeah, of course. It does help you focus your thoughts.
Unless you start drinking water on the second day. That does the that
Well,
causes more of a problem.
yeah, at first, but my personal opinion is the first day of fasting, you should drink quite a bit of water and help flush everything out.
Yeah.
And then after that, you can start dry fasting as well.
Much better.
It helps flush everything out, because otherwise you have intestines that are full for 3 days or 4 days, however long you fast, and then you go to eat again, then it finally comes out. But you don't want to be carrying that around for a few days. It's better to get everything flushed out.
Yeah.
It helps a lot. It helps the autophagy kickstart it. So that's always good. And then, also with your thoughts, fasting helps you concentrate a whole lot better and helps you focus a whole lot better, especially if you can flush your intestines first, because that kicks into gear. Because you flush your intestines, your liver's not going to be, producing sugar from all the leftovers all night long, every night for days, and you can't even get your sugar levels to drop, so you got to get all that stuff out of your guts, all your intestines emptied as well. But then it kicks in that, ketosis, of course, and especially if you can get a little bit of exercise in, it burns off the rest of the blood sugar, kicks into the ketosis, and the ketones are what actually fuels your brain. So it's not glucose so much that fuels your brain, it's actually ketones. And so it really does help your brain start to focus a whole lot better. And of course, when you can start focusing better, your blood sugar levels calm down and all your organs start functioning properly, and the lymph starts flowing again, and everything starts to relax, and the organs work, and it also balances all your hormones. Your hormones come back into balance, and emotionally you become more and more stable the longer it goes on, which is a very good thing for those suffering from things like bipolar. What do they call it now? Manic depressive. I can't remember what they call it now. There's so many different names. What's that?
Thought bipolar was still what they called it.
Yeah, well, it's still referred to under a lot of things. But anyways, so what happens is then, of course, your emotions are regulated and stabilized, and all your hormone balance in your body is stabilized, and it all helps quite a bit. So these are just some simple things that, I'm sure we've all experienced the more we've done it. But when your body is now at peace and you are directing it and controlling it, now you can actually start to hear a little bit better, hear spiritually a little bit better. And it is very, very important to understand that the more clearer you can hear, when your body and your mind and your emotions and everything is out of the way, the more you can hear, because you do have to keep your emotions very calm in order to hear clearly. You do have to keep your mind very still and very quiet in order to hear clearly. If your mind's always chattering away, it's very, very difficult to hear. So you do really have to keep it quiet, and fasting helps these areas a lot. And when the Lord said, this kind cometh not out but by prayer and fasting, it's because when you speak and you say the right words that the Lord wants you to say in the right tone and cadence and everything else, then the power of God flows and it happens, whatever it is that you were directed to do. And this is a very important principle. So obviously, when you have a calling, a mission from the Lord to go and do something, it's always best to fast, right? What do you tell the young prophet? You remember when he's off, go and preach over there in the other country, and you don't eat until you're back in your own country. And that's a long time, and it was a long trip. And he had to follow those instructions in order to fulfill his mission. Because how could he hear clearly enough in order to speak the Lord's words? And of course, every prophet knows this, before it's time to talk, to preach. You always fast, if you get called upon to go and give a blessing, you always fast. You stop, the moment that you're asked, and you fast until, you're back home. And fasting helps you calm your mind and calm your heart so much that you can actually hear clearly. And so it is a big bonus and a magnifier to whatever it is you were doing. And I suppose I should give a warning as well. When you have a lot of anger inside of you and you fast, you magnify that anger. If you decide to hold on to a grudge somewhere and you fast, you magnify the strength of that grudge. And if you have an addiction, it's best to get fast from that addiction, whether it's a physical substance or whether you're looking at like scrolling online hours a day, stuff like that. Um, it's best to get rid of all of those addictions and completely fast from those things and never let them back in. Otherwise, you're not going to hear clearly in order to do the work of God. So there is a bit of a warning there. If you continue with your addiction while you fast, it will make your addiction stronger. And you'll have an even harder time to get rid of that addiction. So just another little warning, because fasting really is a magnifier. It doesn't make whatever it is you're doing, thinking, feeling stronger. And
Everyone does it. Everyone who's even athletes, when you think they're not fasting, they'll cut off everything except for that one thing they have to eat. And they'll cut everything else out of their lives too. Especially for some of them don't even go to see their families. They just stay in focused training.
That's true. That's true. That is true.
But everyone does it for other things too, whenever they're like,
Well, I've seen lots of people fast that claim they couldn't fast. Got a new video game and they fast all day long because they're playing the thing and won't leave it long enough to go get something to eat. They can do it.
yeah.
People can do it for lots of reasons. So, what else about it?
We've just touched on it, but we've done physical fasting and then fasting from addictions, but we haven't gone through the 4 directions of fasting in each of the 4 directions yet.
It's true. That is true. Well, why don't you start us off?
Well, if the first direction would be physically fasting, then the next one would be fasting in our communications, keeping our mouth shut for a few days.
Would be a very good idea.
It certainly has the same effects as physically fasting as well.
It does. It certainly does. Yeah,
And it changes the way you think as well.
it does.
As soon as you're not allowed to talk, well, you actually end up thinking less, as far as I know. When I do it, I certainly end up thinking less.
Yeah, of course. Sometimes when people fast, I think, for example, when they fast, and like if they have a health condition and they need some sort of like you mentioned, athletes would need, the right number of calories and some sort of probably an awful lot of protein and things like that to keep their bodies doing what they need to do. And I've heard people say they've had, you know, health problems when they fasted, like they get headaches and stuff like that. Well, that's because you're seriously addicted and you're going through detox and you need to fast more, not less. But for example, if somebody does need certain thing, maybe they're on a particular diet that they need to follow, that's always good. But you can always fast from other things like bad food,
Yeah.
junk food, garbage food, processed food. You can fast from those things and only eat the actual entire whole food uh, diet, like is what's written in the scriptures, and get rid of all the extra spices and all the extra stuff and just eat very plain, as the scriptures direct, whole food. And
You'll probably find you're eating a lot less anyways, especially if you give an excuse beforehand.
yeah, well, you should control the portion size anyways, even if you do have to eat. Yeah. Anybody know what a portion size is? Anybody actually know? Yeah. That's it. Just whatever little bit there. That's all there is to it. So yeah,
4 squares a day.
yeah, cutting back would be a good plan. So, and I don't know what else. Yeah, so if you have to fast, stop eating all the chocolate. Every time, I don't know, the wife would say every time you fast, all the chocolate goes missing. You gotta cut out the junk food, I guess. So what else?
Well, we could go to the mind next.
Okay.
If you're gonna fast, you can't be listening to music or noise or
Well, the whole
talking.
point of fasting is to actually eliminate that stuff so you can have your mind stop. It needs to have a break.
Right. Even say listening to the scriptures, you can listen to them, but then shut them off and be quiet.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be quiet. Like you can read the scriptures, that's a good thing to do when you're fasting, but then you still have to spend time without thinking.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing wrong with, going into your closet or whatever, stick a chair in there or something, turn out the lights and hide in there for a little while and actually see if you can stop thinking and cut out all of those thoughts.
Yeah, the first time you do it, you might find your mind goes a lot of different places.
Yeah.
But that's not revelation. That's not helpful. That's actually just your own brain trying to feed its addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You have to fast from food. You have to fast from talking.
From giving your opinion.
Fast from giving your opinion.
I find that's more of the no talking thing, just keeps people from, maybe you shouldn't weigh in on the subject. Maybe you should just listen.
Mm-hmm. Fast from thinking.
Yeah.
Definitely need to learn to control your mind. Absolutely.
From all the food you feed into your mind. Your battery's running low.
I have a part here to plug in.
Has to go in the back.
Where is it? There we go. Last one.
Okay.
So, a question that I have, you've mentioned that, if you're going to be giving a blessing to someone, you've been asked to do that, or you're performing a healing, that type of thing. Those are good things that you might be fasting for. What are some of the other things that a person might fast for that are appropriate for that?
You want revelation?
Asking for revelation.
Anything that you want revelation on.
Well, certainly, fasting helps you be able to hear more clearly. And the Lord always does answer us whenever we ask. He actually answers everything that we ask. It's just, do we actually hear? And do we actually hear clearly? And because there are a lot of voices in the spirit world that talk. And are you listening to the right one? So there's a whole lot there that, I mean, you can teach a whole course on that stuff. And it's definitely something that we should do. For example, the next one would be emotional fasting as well. We need to fast from, uh, our emotions. For example, uh, people can get addicted to different emotional states. Some people can get addicted to, like, for example, people like, there's a lot of people who like humor and they're always joking and always telling jokes, things like that. But yet that is a distraction from the Spirit of God. So we do need to fast from that from time to time. There is, some people who are addicted to contention. Some people like to cause trouble, cause problems, and they're very addicted to it. And it's very challenging. And so you have to, all of these various emotions, you need to fast from them and actually stop those emotions and break your addiction to those emotions.
Depression.
Depression, people are
Depression. A lot of
depressed.
people seem to be very addicted to those
Yeah,
self 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 deprecate.
yeah,
If I could say it.
yes. But they are addicted to it, and they're addicted to things like self-loathing and
Yeah.
addicted to things like
Self-depreciation. That's what I meant to say.
yeah, deprecation. But they are addicted to finding a problem in life. They're addicted to looking at the pessimistic side of everything. And people enjoy it. They get so addicted to it, that's their natural state. And you have to fast from those things.
Right.
Be very careful. That's why the Lord told us that we are able to actually control our hearts. And we have to be in control and decide what our hearts are allowed to feel and what they're not allowed to feel. You have to fast from those emotional states. And this helps in gaining revelation and things like that. So it depends on what a person's calling is. What a person is called to do. For example, if somebody is called to be I don't know, the music person, chorister or whatever, to lead the music, that person before going into their calling, before it's time to start their thing, should be fasting for a short time at least before doing that job so they can hear clearly and pay attention. And they should fast all four areas, like you said. They should fast from food. They should fast from talking. They should fast from thinking. Letting their mind range all over. They should fast from those different emotional states and get into the proper uh, peace, calm of the Lord. And then they can pray, of course, and do their job properly. When Moses went up on the mountain, he fasted for 40 days. It took him that long to get everything calmed down and be able to stand in the presence of the Lord and receive the commandments and things like that. It takes time. It took Jonah quite a long time as well.
Yeah. He didn't really have a choice.
Yeah.
Of course, listening to him talk, you wouldn't think he was fasting from emotions. He seemed pretty emotional in the whale.
He did. But then when he explains to the Lord, that now I will go and do the job, and he humbled himself and everything else. So he calmed down
Yeah.
all of those emotions and all of that, those excuses and justification, those weird thoughts he had and everything else. I mean, He just needed a little bit of help. He was put in a sensory deprivation tank and
Yeah.
just had to learn to be calm. So anybody who has a calling should use fasting to magnify um, their ability to hear, but you have to fast in all those things to do that. You can't just fast by food and that's it. That's only one little part, one little piece. Right?
Right.
Oh, very challenging. So what else?
Some people might have a hard time fasting from emotions, people who think their emotions are part of life.
Yeah, some people actually say that they're not in control of their emotions, but
I think some people might get afraid of letting, more than anything, they're afraid of letting go of their emotions. Like, not more than anything, more than they're afraid of letting go of their physical food
it's true.
or their right to spit out their opinion
Yeah,
or their thoughts. They're afraid of letting go of those emotions that they've held on to for so long. Like if they let it go, they're going to disappear. They're going to blink out of existence if they disappear, if those emotions go away.
that is true. That is true.
I don't know. Has anyone else just go out into the woods or go out into a field and just, I'd say be happy, but there's joy there. It's just joy. It doesn't even matter. You can still be upset. You can still be angry. You can still be there, but you can still feel the joy is still there. It didn't go away because you had this emotion or that emotion.
That's when we actually inflict upon ourselves all those nasty emotions and different states of being that we're actually doing damage to ourselves by doing that.
Yeah. So just in case anyone was worried about letting go of their emotions, there's still joy there. Matter of fact, it seems to be there far more prevalent when there are no emotions.
Yeah, so they do seem afraid sometimes.
It's kind of like like when you fast from food and you think you're going to get tired. You might get a little tired, like if you start exercising a lot and you haven't eaten in a few days, but you actually end up getting a lot more energy pretty soon. It does tend to be a little shorter term energy,
Mm-hmm.
but
Really, yeah. As long as you can get your intestines empty, it does really good.
you actually get,
Your body starts living off of all its waste
yeah,
cells and rebuilds everything. So,
your body actually feels a lot better, feels lighter, more emotion, more energy in it. And then the same thing will happen, verbally, mentally,
certainly,
and you'll get stronger mentally and your emotions as well.
if you are trying to control yourself and learn to control yourself, this is just an absolute must. You have to fast in all these directions. It can't be done otherwise. You'll never get there otherwise.
Nobody else, like, does anybody else have, like, if something makes them upset or if they have whatever emotions, do they ever get tired of them and just go outside and take a break for a while? Like, I don't need these emotions right now. I'm gonna go take a break and then I'll come back and feel them later. Procrastinate on them.
I know somebody who was grumpy all the time. Just grumpy, grumpy, grumpy. Every single day it's grumpy. And it's so funny. And they're so addicted to being grumpy. And they couldn't let it go. Couldn't even go for one simple little day without being grumpy. Because they just until they get too tired and they forget they're supposed to be grumpy for half a second and they remember, oh yeah.
That does happen a lot.
Which proves that they can't do it.
Yeah. Wonder if maybe they're afraid of losing all the work they put into it.
to being grumpy. Yeah,
A lot of people do that when they put a lot of effort or work into building something. The idea of quitting and not, working on it constantly gets harder and harder.
absolutely.
Like, don't worry.
Yeah, I
All
could
those things will
figure it
be
out
there
now.
when you come back, but
Yeah.
you won't.
Let's just take a break for a while, you know. Take a break from being grumpy and just, you know, even if you have to lock yourself in a room somewhere where nobody can see you, and then smile. Be
I said
happy
the
for a minute.
woods.
Take a break. Should fast from grumpiness.
Being grumpy or being happy is a behavior that we choose.
Certainly
Absolutely.
is.
We feed those thoughts, whatever they may be, whether it be for happiness or uh, for for grumpiness or sadness or joy. We're the ones that feed that wolf inside of us. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Though I still think some people confuse happiness and joy
That is
because
true. That is true.
yeah,
you don't need the emotion for happiness because the joy still exists there. It
Mhm.
doesn't go away. It's always there waiting for you.
Absolutely.
they
I
confuse
like,
pleasure with happiness or with joy.
That too,
Joy,
yeah.
joy is lasting. Pleasure is fleeting.
Certainly. Absolutely. Yeah. Well,
yeah,
there are so many aspects to fasting that really it should be a whole big thing. It shouldn't just be stop eating something. There should be all of these four things.
well,
Mhm.
it's stop eating in all four directions.
Yeah.
You have to stop feeding your body, feeding your opinion, feeding
Yeah.
your mind, feeding your emotions.
Yeah. Well, I think every Sunday people should do it
Yeah.
because it should be a day of holiness, right? It means you don't have to be spouting your opinion to anybody. You're supposed to be being good. Just use the gospel and be nice, be uplifting, help people.
How do you know what's in the gospel?
We should have learned in the week.
You're supposed to fast and pray for it.
There you go. Fast and pray for it. Yep. Yep. It's good. You should be fasting from all weird emotions and weird states of behavior and thinking. You should fast from those, especially us.
Or maybe fast from your normal behaviors and ways of thinking.
There you
Not
go.
the weird ones, the ones you already have.
Yeah.
Maybe weird is something you should look for. The uncommon behavior that maybe the common one is the problem.
Well, just be holy on all four directions and away you go, right?
Yeah. That's easy. You stop eating and then you
Well,
stop talking unless moved.
there's another aspect, of course. What's it say in the Old Testament? It said, "Is this the fast that I've asked for?" Right? When he said, "All you do is
Oh, right. Yeah.
stop
It
eating
says
and
all you do
cover
is stop
yourself in
eating and
sackcloth and ashes and go around whining how sad you are and how lowly you are and how humble you are and how whatever." And they said, "This isn't the fast that I want."
you
He
say
wants you to.
stop from your pride and stop from your vanity and stop from robbing the poor and the orphans and the
It was actually that fast he wanted was that you would go and take care of the poor.
right.
You would go and feed the hungry. You would go and clothe the naked. You would go and do all of those things. And he said that is the fast that he has asked for. So he's asked for us to fast from our own stuff, our own greed, our own everything.
Right.
Fast from ourselves and care about others.
Like Job. They never did say Job was fat though. Everyone just assumed that.
I don't know.
And he had everything, but could still talk to the Lord. You could still go to him because,
But he also fasted a lot too and offered sacrifice a lot
yeah, but
because
he
he had
was,
bratty family.
yeah, but he fasted by taking care of people.
Mhm.
Whenever there was somebody in need, and it only really says his own servants, but whenever there was someone in need, he would take care of them first. That's why he had everything in the first place.
Yeah. Well, but that's why he could also fast because he gave his food away. So he didn't have any to eat.
Yeah.
Also, why he, even like in the book of Tobit there. Tobit was that way. Anytime he would sit down to a meal, he had to go out and find somebody. He went out and found a poor person, brought him in,
Yeah,
and fed him. Well, it keeps Tobit from eating too much too, doesn't it?
it does.
And that's the fast that the Lord has asked of us to do. So it's very interesting.
So I guess if you've got too much food on your plate, you're doing something wrong somewhere else.
Yeah, no kidding. If a person can't control something so simple and easy as physically fasting from food, they're not going to be able to fast very well enough in the other areas to even get to the Lord.
No.
You got to be able to control yourself. And the whole point of fasting is so that you can feed other people. The whole point of fasting is so that you can get in the same wavelength as the Lord, get in the same frequency and actually hear him and hear him clearly. That's why we fast.
Right.
You need to teach, you need to fast. If you need to give a blessing, you need to fast. If you need to move a mountain, you need to fast. Or get out of the way fast in case it falls over. That's another good fast.
Keep fasting until you're quickened.
So you're quickened enough to get out of the way. I know. I just think it's funny. Okay. You need to fast from humor. There you go. Was that long enough?
But that doesn't mean fast from a happy countenance.
That's right. You're not supposed to be of a sad countenance. You're supposed to be of a happy countenance, but you're not supposed to use a whole lot of laughter.
No.
You're still supposed to be happy
And you're still supposed to be sober-minded.
and joyful. I think fasting, basically, the principle applies in every aspect of the gospel, doesn't it? Seems like it does.
Well, you can fast from other things too. How about fasting from driving your car?
I'm
You
driving my car too fast.
can claim you need your car to get to work, but a lot of people don't.
That's true.
And I know people who've walked 40 minutes to get to their job, so car didn't start, so or actually maybe a couple hours earlier. They started a couple hours earlier and
Yep.
walked to.
That's true. That lots. Fasting from laziness would be another good fast.
Yeah,
That'd be a really good fast. Get up and exercise, go for a walk, do some push-ups,
get in the habit of always doing something and then
do something. Learn Tai Chi. That's a nice, slow moving
that's a
one.
good one because nobody can make an excuse that they can't calm their mind down if they're always doing something. Well, do Tai Chi.
And people call it meditation in motion. It's very good.
It's a very good way of keeping your mind quiet because you have to focus on each little step.
Yeah, it's true. It's a very good start. So now we have to come up with a gospel Tai Chi. This is, grasping the scriptures by the tail.
It's just writing out the books. And they're like, You've only got
Instead-
450 more pages to do.
Instead of this with parting the water, you're opening the
Opening the scriptures, presenting them.
presenting it. Yeah. Yeah, we'll have to come up with a whole bunch of fun little names. That's funny.
Have to do turning the page in that way.
Yeah.
Only 4,560 more times.
You know.
Did we
Well,
get off topic? How about even though when you fast physically and your body goes into ketosis and it starts generating more energy? Well, I think we already mentioned it, but it does the same thing for your mind
that's
when you fast from
because your mind
light-mindedness.
works. It'll also steady your emotions too.
Right.
But your brain can focus a whole lot better.
Right. But you can also fast from light-mindedness
Yeah, absolutely.
because that's an important thing to cut out. And it's not the same as having a lazy mind. As a matter of fact, your mind gets more energy. Your mind can do things faster. It does not become lazy if you stop thinking all the time. It actually stays on high alert.
Light-mindedness really does mean lazy mind.
Yeah. Or stop. Scriptures used a different word for it, I think. It used the word light-mindedness, but it also meant it said light thoughts.
Well, it's there
Don't
some
say that.
a whole bunch of them. I don't know.
Stop thinking about the things that are not helping you, that are just
Yeah,
the things
of course.
you're worried, like the things you want to worry about for fun.
Yep.
If it's not important, turn your brain off and stop thinking about it. And your brain won't get lazy just because you're not thinking about anything. It'll actually become a little bit sharper and a little bit faster to respond. Are we still connected? Oh, I saw Kevin blink. I know we're still connected.
I'm here.
Well, does anyone have any comments they'd like to say?
Good stuff.
I know some people fast from social media and from TV, from movies. There's lots of things we can give up.
And if our whole focus is based on getting to the Lord, if our whole focus is based on being able to actually hear Him and hear clearly, fasting, we have to fast and fast from an awful lot, everything in our lives, because we need, the whole point of it is that those things don't distract us from our main motivation. I mean, our main desire to get to the Lord, right? We have to be able to succeed at that. And of course, even to take it further, if you can fast from all of those things and really actually control all of, your emotional and your thinking and your communications and everything, your physical, and from all those other distractions in the world, you'll be able, and as you strive to get to the Lord, you'll even start seeing, you'll start being able to see through the veil and start being able to see the veil. Most people don't even get to the point where they can see the veil, let alone see through it. And you fasting, you can't even do that if you don't fast. It doesn't even happen. You really have to fast to be able to see. And a lot of times it's really not just food, because you can eat plain foods, small portions, and don't eat only what you need and just to fuel your body and still fast from everything else at the same time.
Right. It's a lot smaller than people think.
What's that?
The amount they just need to fuel their body is smaller than you think it is. It's all, no, everyone, anyone who says I need to eat this much to fuel my body. No, you need to eat less. Probably about a fifth of that.
Yeah. Well, I'm using the excuse that yesterday we had a birthday, and I may have eaten an extra piece of cake and an extra plate 3 or 4 times of food, and
And a basket of towels.
now I need to fast for the week. When in reality, I mean, I think I ate a whole week's of food yesterday.
Yep.
But I'm fasting now, right now, anyways, for the last few hours. Anyways, just to try and get everything ready for this meeting.
Right. You mentioned fasting from laziness. What about fasting from omission?
Fasting from what?
Omission.
Yeah, fasting from omission. That's a good one.
Fasting from fear, from hesitation.
Sure.
Got to be a day where you're like, don't need to worry about any of that stuff and just do what you're supposed to do.
Fast from cowardice every once in a while. Actually stand up and be good.
Yeah.
You know, everybody is always trying to apply peer pressure to you. How about you fast from that? Fast from being a coward and do what you're supposed to do anyway.
Yeah.
How about that?
And fast from friends.
Yeah. What if you had a guy who was too scared to say anything? And then he tried to convince himself he was fasting from talking.
Well, did he fast from in all the other circles?
Yeah.
Soon enough, once he got to the emotions,
It's probably time to fast from being a coward and stand up and be good.
yeah.
Yeah. I think fasting plays an important role in the gospel. Without it, you're never going to progress, really. I mean, to anybody who's just getting started, I would just pick one thing to start with. Get used to doing it. Do it every single week, you know, at least every Sunday. And start there. And then after you get that one down, which shouldn't take you more than 1 or 2 Sundays, and then do the next one.
Yeah.
Add 2, then 3, then 4. I mean, there's 52 weeks in a year. By the time you're done a year, you've got 52 things you've succeeded at and overcome. I'd say that's pretty good.
Yes.
Instead of spending your whole lifetime claiming, well, I'm still trying to learn how to fast from eating for a day. I mean, my goodness. Might as well succeed 52 times. 52 different things. That'd be the end of a pretty good year.
Yeah.
You'd be doing really good at the end of the year. Then don't go back to it.
Nope.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, you can fast from different vices. You can fast from being, you know, upset. You can fast from being angry. You can fast from contending. You can fast from giving justifications. You can fast from complaining.
Yeah, that's a
Don't
good
even
one.
complain in your brain. Fast from all the different vices. That'd be nice.
Fast from shoes.
Yeah, I agree with that one.
A lot of people are too. But then they make excuses again. Well, I need the shoes to do this and do that. I'm like, no, you don't.
Mm. There's all kinds of things.
If your arches fall, just walk on the balls of your feet.
There you go. You get good calf muscles.
Yep. If you get tired halfway, maybe it wasn't all that important where you were going.
There you go. Well, this is a very important topic. If there's any questions or comments, everybody can feel free to share.
Did that answer your question, Rick?
Yes, this is exactly what I was hoping for, looking for, wondering about. I only was reading about so much of it, and wanted to be able to take a better step, and this helps a lot. So I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. Hopefully it touches on a lot of things.
It does. It does.
Great topic.
Sounds pretty good to me. Should we close?
Yes, nobody else has anything else to say.
They're fasting. What's the matter?
Just the goat that something popped up, but I couldn't read it fast enough. Just something about fast shoes.
Yeah.
Something in the chat.
Well, anyways.
It's Ragnar here, Sebastian,
Oh,
whichever.
that's who you are. Okay.
Yeah, I was saying with studying emergency medicine and things like that, and I worked on an ambulance last week for a shift. And yeah, going without shoes or boots, that would be dangerous with all the human products all over the place.
When you're in emergency response unit, you need to dress appropriately in your gear with all the stuff you need.
Yeah, you don't have to
Exactly.
fast during saving people's lives. That's not
That
the time
is-
to do it.
That is the fast.
It is.
Yeah,
You're
there you
fast.
go.
You're fasting from going barefoot.
Exactly.
You fast from things you want, and you take care of somebody else and do the job that God gave you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. What's the other one? Oh, what about group fasts, community fasts? Not
I think the whole community should fast from all of this stuff. Then everybody be good.
what about when Gandhi asked all of India to fast with him?
That's true.
That worked fast. That worked.
It did.
The crime rate went down to almost nothing, and all of a sudden,
Nobody had the energy to steal anything.
the country that was going to go to war decided that they'd
Yeah.
rather have peace.
Yeah, that is true.
And it's not like all the people who wanted war were the ones listening to him in the first place. It was everybody else who was listening to him.
Mm-hmm. No. Community fasts work very good. The whole idea of fasting is that it brings you more and more in tune with the Lord. And if everybody's doing it, everybody has a little bit more patience with each other. Everybody has, a little more happiness and helpfulness to each other.
Right.
Everybody gets along a whole lot better. The angels come, support everybody behaving. Absolutely. There is the power of alignment there, right? Powers of heaven actually flow when we align ourselves to that pure conduit. What did Full Scroll call it? Like being like a hollow bone, right?
Right.
Because there's nothing to get in the way now, because he fasts from everything. And that's why power can flow through you. We all have that ability to have power flow through us. And the more of these areas that we fast, the more clean we become inside, the more we overcome all these things. Pretty soon it won't be just every Sunday, it'll be every day. It'll
Right.
just be a natural way that we want to be. And the power flows through us a whole lot more, a great deal more.
Find that when I fast, I lose a lot of desires for things like the
Right.
cell phone or
That is true.
picking fights or
I haven't figured that one out yet. I always seem to be causing a fight somewhere.
yep, if you're fasting, you wouldn't worry about that.
That's right. Plus, like you said, you're lighter and you're barefoot, so you're able to run a lot faster.
Yeah.
Get out of the fight. You win on all ends, I guess.
Well,
Okay,
if
so
no one else has anything to say, then is there a volunteer out there for a closing prayer? Is there a volunteer in here
Well,
for a
there's-
closing prayer?
down here, let's speak up.
I don't know why I'm signing in front of the camera because I don't have to say it out loud, but I signed in front of the camera.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Dear Heavenly Father, we are thankful that we were able to gather over the internet with our friends and family around the world and that we could share the gospel. Please bless that your spirit will be with us and with all of our friends and family around the world. In the name of Yeshua Messiah, Amen.
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 Let's